Hello everybody, Silverbusters here, coming at you with another video, and today what I want to discuss is what appears to be the general public's inability to understand very large numbers and very small numbers, and therefore their inability to understand and make proper adjustments when it comes to various risks that they might encounter, whether it would be in day to day life, like driving a vehicle, say, with the respiratory illness that's been spreading around recently, or with understanding things like the size of the national debt, exponential growth, based on inflation or debt loads increasing. So it just seems to be pretty natural that humans can understand relatively small groups of things pretty easily. Actually, if you want to have a really strong relationship with people, the number is between 150 and 300 people max that you can have a real individual one-on-one relationship with before your brain just starts categorizing them into different buckets based on, institutions or broader ideas like nations. So there's the kind of things that we would come in contact with as hunter-gatherers in our as modern humans, but in our primitive state. There's really no time when a hunter-gatherer, a modern human, would need to understand the concept of a million of anything, right? Their tribe might be 150 or 300 people. A herd of buffalo or might be 1,000, right? Uh, what kind of a situation could someone be in where they need to understand a million? Can you see a million trees at the same time? Even if you're at the top of the highest mountain peak, can you see a million trees? And even if you did, would that have any meaning? Would you be able to go up there and say, oh, there's a million and one, and you wouldn't be able to make the distinction. It would just be there's a lot of trees, right? So that's the kind of situation we get in with people, is that the vast majority of people don't understand large numbers. If you can pretty much intermingling, if you go with millions, billions, or trillions, I don't think if we did like a man on the street kind of thing, maybe we should do that one day and like ask them what is bigger, millions, billions, trillions, right? And ask them to put it in order and see how many people can even get those broad categories right. But there's situations where it can be really misleading. Like, let's say you were against some kind of spending program, right? You might say it's you know $980 million, right? You make the number sound really big because you're using 980 million, right? Whereas another person who would support that spending program might come in and say, oh, yes, our spending program is just under $1 billion. Okay, and so the numbers are ballpark, right? They're 980 million and 1 billion, just coming in under 1 billion, pretty much the same thing, right? But yet they're using the fact that there's more numbers in 980 million, and it takes more syllables to spit out 980 million than it does to say just under a billion, right? You can spit it out really quick, right? And And it's these kind of things. The average person doesn't understand the difference. They might, under a certain strain of a situation, be made to understand a particular situation, but then they don't know the time frame. Are we talking about a monthly expense or an annual expense? Are we talking about a one-time expense? Is there an interest rate? How high is that interest rate? Is the money borrowed? Is it coming out of savings? Is it coming out of taxation? There's going to be a large number of people who don't even get the starting number right, and they can't even talk about any of the other, potential things that might be affected in the economy or the government, because they're dealing with our hunter-gatherer brain, counting on their fingers, up from 12 up to 60, uh, like the ancients used to, and that's how we ended up with 180 degrees or 360 degrees in 60 minutes in an hour, because of how they counted on their fingers back in the day. And you can live a perfectly fine human existence in a primitive state without ever needing to know, a number of a billion or a million. A large army might be a few thousand men, 10,000 men. A large city might be 100,000 people. Only a few cities in the ancient world ever got to even being 1 million people. And even then, you had different subdivisions and things along those lines. So it's perfectly understandable why people don't understand this, and that's why it takes so much effort when you're talking about the economy or gold and silver investments or investments in general, that it takes there's a big input of energy of that you have to use just to get the basis down. Like most people don't know the difference. I mean, I'm kind of railing on that point right now, but let's look at it from the other way. Let's look at it from people don't understand small numbers, right? And this has to do with more like risk of catching an illness, or risk of a bond defaulting, or risk of a company going out of business, or risk of a currency collapsing, right? So you can get into a situation where a risk is relatively small, but devastating if it occurs. So that's something like, oh, if you have all of your money in the stock market and the stock market crashes, or you have all your money in the bank in US dollars and they declare a bank holiday and they lop a couple zeros off of your balance because they have to rebalance in accordance with some sort of new global currency that they're going to try to use to get rid of the debt problems that everybody has around the world, because they have too much debt, because people keep asking for benefits and they don't know the difference between a million, a billion, or a trillion, right? So people don't understand those tiny risks that have massive implications. Like if we draw a simple little comparison chart, like say a 4x4 set of squares, and you've got high risk and low risk on one axis, and high impact and low impact on another axis, we could put something like a currency event devaluing your savings as a relatively low chance of happening. It only happens, it happens more frequently in a lot of mismanaged countries like Argentina or something along those lines. But, maybe once in a lifetime is, a reserve currency, 40, 50 years, something like that. So it's relatively low occurrence, but it has a very high impact on you when in fact it does happen. So you've got this drastic risk that requires you to make some sort of preparation for it. And people don't understand this. That they say, "Oh, the risk is tiny. So they end up being greedy instead of fearful when they should be fearful, because the most important thing isn't necessarily the likelihood of an event happening, is how likely you are to be able to bounce back from that event happening in the event it does happen. Because uncommon events do happen, and most people get into a situation where they think, oh, an uncommon event is uncommon, but the humans categorize it as never happening because it infrequently happens, right? Which is another miscalculation based on our limited perception and our limited ability to imagine things. Now let's compare that to a another type of category. Let's say on that same axis we have a low probability of well, let's say it's a high probability of something happening, like being exposed to a respiratory illness. But if we go and look at the data for the people who have had negative effects, like say dying, if we're going to have a put this in the high impact box on the risk category, then we need to be able to have a serious impact there, like say death or some kind of long-term serious illness. The chance of you being exposed to this respiratory illness is quite high, at least being exposed to it, but the likelihood of you actually having a serious impact on your health is actually quite low. But we get the opposite reaction, because it's quite likely to happen. It's quite likely for you to be exposed to this thing, even though the likelihood of for most people, the impact is going to be low. So yeah, you'll probably get exposed to it, but the impact to you is going to be low. In fact, you may not even notice it. You may be one of these asymptomatic people that just has enough vitamin C and vitamin D in your system in order to keep going. And you never really, maybe you have a headache and you go to bed early and you never know that you were exposed to it. And now you've got immunity to it, apparently better immunity than from getting any of the shots for this particular respiratory illness. But people instead, they don't categorize this. They don't realize that the people at high risk, they're unwilling to, or they're being manipulated by people who want this fear to be increased so that the humans can be easily stripped of their rights and resources and things of that nature. Is that your percentage chance out of all 7 or 8 billion people on the planet of being in the group that has a real long-term negative effect or serious effect from this is really quite low. Most people, your high likelihood of being exposed, but low likelihood of a catastrophic event as a result. But you see the complete opposite reaction of, say, the past situation where we have people demanding the highest levels of lockdowns and police in the street shooting protesters and all sorts of crazy stuff just because of this tiny chance you have of having a long-term illness effect from this respiratory illness that's been going around. And it just seems crazy that people don't understand these risks, because your actual risk out of the 7 or 8 billion people on the planet of being in that group is absolutely tiny. And a while ago, there was a real interesting article on the web that did a study in the state of Michigan, and it was if you were under the age of 45, you were twice as likely to die in a traffic accident than you were to die from this particular respiratory illness that was going around. And it didn't really get to parity until around age 55 when we had the same number of people being at risk from the motor accidents and the respiratory illness at the same rate. And then your risk was dramatically higher if you were in the, the 65, 75, especially the 85 in plus category. If you jump on the CDC and you look at the actual statistics, the vast majority of the real long-term negative effects from this respiratory illness are pretty much confined to that real high age bracket. So is anybody coming out and saying, hey, grandma and grandpa, you should take extra steps to protect your health while the rest of us go about the business of running the world because we're the worker bees and we're in our middle age of productivity and you need to let us do our thing. It's like, no, that's not what they want. Somehow the response we get from the government isn't to let the high risk groups take the behavior that would protect them as high risk individuals, and instead they demand that the draconian lockdown measures and the mandates and all of that fall upon the group that have an absolutely tiny chance of a negative effect, even though they have a high likelihood of being exposed. And it just destroys me that, I am not the brightest man in the world. I am not the absolutely smartest. But I can put pen to paper and do probabilities, right? I can understand what the cost is to take a certain action, such as, locking down a country, destroying its supply chain, debasing its currency, having to actively manipulate bond markets and the gold and silver markets and try to suppress inflation with all of these hedonic adjustments that the central banks do. It's just ridiculous. And they take all of these steps just because they have to manipulate these people that don't or won't understand the very large and very small numbers, and very large when it comes to our debts, sadly, and very small when it comes to our actual risk when it's posed to this particular respiratory illness that's been going around recently. Anyway, this idea just struck me as that, and I had to make a video on it real quick. I wanted to throw that out there for you guys. What do you think about this topic? I mean, do you think that there's a lot of people that you are around you that are good with numbers and calculating risks and costs and benefit ratios when it comes to taking different actions when it comes to your individual life or individual financial situation? Do you feel like those outside of, say, the kind of gold and silver community, the hard money asset people, that they just don't have the ability to understand these risks and numbers and are just floating on this tide of fear? Because that's the feeling I get a lot of the time. Anyway, just throwing this out there as an extra video for you guys. This has been Silverbusters signing off. Hopefully you're having a great day. Talk to you later.